let's kick things off in the whole interview just in terms of where this particular concept in this project ended up coming from. Because if I'm not mistaken, I think maybe a particular extra shout out to Victor and the podcast Opinionated History of Math is warranted, because I think both you and I had listened to this series that he did all about Euclid, and there's so many gems from that. And in some ways that was the soil from which this project was born. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah. Yeah. I think in our initial conversation, I had maybe a couple of ideas for things that I'd been thinking about, but this was the one that felt the strongest to me and to you as well. And I remember I had mentioned that podcast, and you were like, "Oh, that's funny you mentioned that." I was even maybe thinking about trying to get a video from Victor, but he's not a video creator, so I wasn't sure how that would work and so on. And it was kind of a perfect alignment. For anybody who hasn't listened to it, this one is an 18 episode season about taking Euclid's Elements and using it as a reference point to kind of trace through the history of geometry and the philosophy of geometry. I thought it was great. I thought it was funny and insightful, and really there was a lot in there. But that was also the challenge then for trying to make a video. There was a point where I thought that I would get all the way through book one and include the Pythagorean theorem. And then there was another point that I couldn't imagine how I was going to possibly even get past the postulates. So
Right. Yeah. Now, any piece of creative work often has a value that is best measured by the quality of the highest quality thing that was removed from it before final, right? And so I'm curious, what was the part that you most resisted cutting out, or you were saddest to see let go?
let me think about that I was saddest to see go. The parts that made it as far as the draft that went on Patreon, where there were a couple of scenes that I cut, that at that point, I actually didn't feel sad to take those out. I felt more as though I was leaving certain things in out of a sense of obligation to present a complete argument. There was a discussion of postulate 4, which is that all right angles are equal. And again, this is one of those things where in the text it's one short sentence, and yet to this day there are academic papers coming out, people arguing back and forth about what it means and what its purpose is. And not only that, but what it means for our hypotheses about what the methodology would have been for the ancient Greeks, which is kind of the core conversation of the video. And there's one hypothesis about postulate 4 potentially having to do with excluding cone points, and you had made an animation, helped me with an animation for that. The idea being, if you have a cone, then and we form a right angle by drawing a straight line and cutting it in half, then if you draw a straight line that goes over the top of the cone and then perform that same maneuver and then cut the party hat open so it's a sector of a circle, then you no longer have 90-degree angles. You have something smaller. One thing, though, that I did really want to include that just didn't have a place at all was this other idea about how we can look at the text of the Elements and understand that it comes out of an oral tradition, because every single proposition in the Elements, it does a couple of things. One is that it starts and ends in kind of the same way, like there's this formulaic, like a template almost. And every time a previous proposition or postulate is cited, it doesn't say like, proposition 1.5, turn to page 300 and whatever. Instead, Greek mathematical writing can be seen as sort of a transcription of an oral tradition. And so the idea would be that these things were meant to be memorized. And the way that you have an audience or what have you recall the earlier proposition is you say it word for word in the exact same way that they would have previously memorized it. Victor describes it as being almost like the chorus of a song, where once you hear the first few words of the chorus, you have no choice but to sing along. And not only that, but you can't like stop in the middle. You have to say the whole thing. So one little interesting thing that you find in the Elements is that when he is citing a previous proposition, for example, if a proposition for side angle side says that this means that the sides are congruent and the angles are congruent and the areas are equal. Later on, you'll have some other proof where you need the fact that the sides are all congruent, but for some reason he says the whole thing. The sides are congruent and the angles are equal and the areas are equal. And he didn't actually need those other two parts, but it's the chorus of the song. You have to sing the whole chorus in order to convey that information in the other person's head. So those sorts of things where there's this idea that the text has odd little qualities to it that almost seem like anomalies or just seem like they don't make sense. If you actually follow what they might have been for, they end up being evidence potentially for something about the practice, which the Greeks were notoriously did not actually, they didn't write about in any way that that has made its way to us.
Yeah, that kind of detail is delightful, right? Because it takes something that feels like it's bad writing, like why are you giving the superfluous words, but it actually adds a lot more extra color to what it was. For me, I'm curious at how much this resonates with other members of the audience, because this is maybe very personal, but like there was a very strong parallel between understanding what Euclid was really getting at with constructions and like my own process for making videos with programmatic animation, where very often there might be a given piece of math and there's the theory of it that I can scribble down on my page. And then there's a very different thought process that goes into like constructing it, like making it exist on the screen. And this does like a couple things. One, it always feels like it clarifies my thinking, just inevitably the act of having to put it there. So that makes it feel like real in some sense. Like I made a couple videos about topology where the thrust of a given proof is that like there exists such and such, but then you want to animate such and such, and you realize there's this huge gap between like the topological argument that like it must exist and then writing an algorithm to actually find it. And what I hadn't appreciated is that which felt like a very modern thing, like wanting to implement it on a computer, to like make it feel real, to expose the errors, all of that, like was actually maybe more reflective of how people's relationship was with math through most of history, is feeling a certain discomfort if it wasn't concretized in that way. And I think this is maybe why, like you had thrown out a number of possible conclusions, like where's the video landing? The one I like expressed the most excitement about, maybe because it was just personal for me, the construction is the code, what code does for us. And I think so many members of the audience have this feeling like, hey, if I can make this simulation for the probability rather than just theorizing it, like it makes it feel real. Like that as an instinct has all of these echoes. And I don't know, that was sufficiently surprising for me. Like that's when I started to really get especially excited about this particular project. What was your experience like for deciding what the point should be or what the thesis should be? Was it a clicking resonance? Was it more of like a gradual gradient descent towards what felt right?
Probably a gradual descent, because I think that idea that you just expressed so well was in the front of my mind as well. I think even the way I approached kind of trying to like beat this thing into shape over the course of working on it, at a certain point I was like, okay, well, I have to actually physically do these constructions and actually like go through in order to understand really what it is that we're talking about with the elements. And by the way, I think any audience member who's kind of interested in this but hasn't engaged with the primary text itself, it's very like readable, and it is really a manual. You can really take out a ruler and compass and do this stuff. And I'm not a computer coder, but there are many similar ways where actually having to instantiate something changes it from what you had in your mind. And I did find that kind of core idea as a point of resonance as I was working on this. Absolutely. And then the other core idea, which you also kind of touched on, is this fact that constructions, which today I think a lot of maybe modern mathematicians would look at constructions as being sort of not really math, because that's not how we do math today. Physical tools, that kind of thing. But in fact, it was not only successful for the Greeks, but successful for so long in the centuries that followed, that it's worth investigating further why there's more to it. That's kind of like the main thesis of a paper that Victor pointed me to through his podcast by Kenneth Manders. It might be behind a paywall, but we can link to it in the notes. That's really kind of his main thesis. Like, we should take a closer look at what these constructions really are all about and what their purpose was within ancient Greek geometry, because they were so successful for so long.
Yeah. And the thing that they're successful at also, it's not so much what we think of as applications of geometry, but like having irrefutable truth.
Yeah. This was a detail that I really, I hope that it comes across in the video. It was a very subtle detail that you kind of have to show rather than just tell. We're not like doing experiments, we're not like drawing a picture and kind of seeing, oh, well, what is, let's measure that line and see whether it's congruent or something like that. It's actually doing these physical things for an abstract theoretical purpose, which I find very fascinating. And in terms of trying to express that to a viewer, I hope it was successful in expressing that.
I'm willing to bet that it was. Now, zooming out a little bit, you are relatively new to the math YouTube scene, right? It was like around 2 years ago or so that you started making some projects. What brought you to that? What led you to making these like math history type documentaries?
I used to be a musician. I went to music school. I minored in maths. In my 20 years in New York City, I've been a math tutor. That's how I've made my living. So I've had a lot of practice communicating high school level math and physics in a one-on-one setting. A little bit before the pandemic, there was a sequence, there was I was reaching a sort of burnout point with music and the music industry, I would say. Then I had my daughter, and then the pandemic happened, and all of those things kind of took me away from what I had been doing and forced me to really reconsider what my creative life would look like and what I was doing with myself. And so I kind of found my way to YouTube just to kind of see, maybe the original idea was maybe, I can use all this tutoring that I've been doing, put it into some kind of, I don't know, digital form. It was half formed, but I decided I would just try some stuff. And I started by making like very simple whiteboard videos. I made, over the course of a couple months, I made like, a dozen or something, explaining the quadratic formula and factoring and stuff like that. And I just realized it wasn't for me. It wasn't creative enough. There are already channels that do that, like basically homework help videos really, really well. They have a huge library of thousands of videos. So in order to kind of compete with those channels, you would also need to have thousands of homework help videos so a student can come back to you every time they have a different question. And I just realized that was not what I wanted to do. So I had this idea. It was actually inspired by something in Steve Strogatz's book, Infinite Powers, where he talks about Archimedes and how Archimedes used this particular method of finding the area of a circle and how that connects to infinitesimals and later calculus. I just had this kind of idea in my head that what if I have a sort of slightly over the top dramatic, like the movie trailer voice, in a world where, this sort of thing about that. And I just thought it would be fun and funny. You can go back and watch this video. It's not very good by, I've grown a lot since then, but I made it. And in the course of doing that, I switched from iMovie to DaVinci Resolve, and I started to learn the basics of how to make some animations and so on and so forth. And that video did, to my great surprise, very well. And I was like, okay, well, this is something that I certainly find exciting and interesting, and I would love to do more of. And obviously other people are interested in it too. I always felt that in the context of high school students who learn math, you have these textbooks where there's always those sidebars, Isaac Newton, and it says born da 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 da, and there's this two paragraph explanation of whoever the person is, and the student inevitably says, well, this isn't going to be on the test, so I'm not even going to read that. And it's just kind of like this dry, like, this has nothing to do with my life or anything. But to me, there's a way to bring these things to life that makes it, it's not teaching math, but it is providing some sort of different angle of motivation.
I think you're onto something, because all good teaching has to be preceded by effective motivation. I mean, there's the beauty of the material, there's the application, but I think a very real one that you're hitting on that is just not in the DNA of like math teachers to emphasize a lot is just the human story behind a lot of that. And you see evidence of this success, right, in terms of, I feel like there's this second rise of Veritasium as a dominant player on the YouTube science realm. It's like phase one is just like Derek being Derek, and like phase two is like Derek figuring out how to like have a team around it. And in that second one, there's a lot of math.
And surprisingly, those math history videos are sometimes among the most successful.
Exactly. Right. They do particularly well. And it's the math ones, but it's always story driven and driven by the humans behind it and like a little bit of history. And it's like there's this intro bit that's, yada, yada, exciting thing. And then 2 minutes in, it's like back in 1400. And, it's like suddenly going back and stepping all the way through.
I think narrative, I mean, another reference point for me as I was finding my way to this was even during my time as a musician, I grew to love well-produced narrative podcasts, Serial. And I always kind of wanted to do that sort of thing. But I guess I was turning 40 around the time that I started making YouTube videos, and it's like, I don't know, like these people have been doing this for decades now by the time they're my age, so how could I possibly get started with something like that? But then I realized that if I just find this territory that's relatively open, like it speaks to existing skills that I have, like the fact that I have this sort of unusual constellation of skills can in fact be an advantage. And I think that's a good thing. I think YouTube is a great place for people with an unusual constellation of skills in general. But because I have this background where I've had the practice explaining math for so long, and specifically explaining it to one person at a time, which I think is also a really great practice for YouTube, because even though it's a mass medium, it's kind of talking to one person. I was like, well, why don't I just try doing that thing that I love in this completely other context, but applying it to math, where I somewhat uniquely, compared to podcast producers at WNYC or something, I have some experience as well. So that was another like entry point. That human story was something that was really motivating for me.
Well, I'm excited to see more of what you have to produce. I'll call it an end there in terms of interview of added details for the extra curious viewers. Obviously, links to your channel and then other videos of it are in the description of this video and the original. Thanks again for doing this.
Absolutely. Thank you.